This video was brought to you by Imprint. Last Friday, at a campaign speech in North Carolina, Vice President and Democrat nominee Kamala Harris gave us the most detailed outline of her economic policy agenda yet. In the speech, Harris announced her intention to create a, quote, opportunity economy by building up the middle class, and advocated for, among other things, a sharp increase in house building, a ban on so-called price gouging, and generous tax benefits for families. So in this video, we're going to take a look at Harris's economic policies, why parts of the media don't like them, and why they'll probably go down well with voters. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's get straight into it. As we see it, Harris articulated basically 4 big policies last week, which all tell us something about her economic policy platform more generally. The first of these was to do with medical costs, or more specifically, how to lower them. Here, Harris wants to accelerate and expand a Biden administration effort allowing Medicare and other federal programs to negotiate with drug makers to lower the cost of prescription medication. This is sort of what happens in the UK with the NHS, and the thinking here is that the federal government will be able to negotiate the lowest cost from drug makers, because the size of a Medicare contract will incentivize drug makers to lower their prices. Harris hopes that these measures will cut the cost of some of the most expensive and most commonly used drugs by as much as 80%, starting in 2026. Harris also said that she wants to cancel a further $7 billion of medical debt for up to 3 million Americans. Harris's second policy of note relates to support for families. Specifically, Harris wants to restore a COVID-era $3,600 per child tax credit and introduce a new $6,000 tax credit for the first year of a child's life. Now, these policies should go down well with the electorate, both because, well, who doesn't like tax credits, but also because there's a growing sense that having children is becoming too expensive in America. It also contrasts nicely with a policy proposed by J.D. Vance back in 2021 that's since resurfaced, where he advocates for higher taxes on childless people. Even though these policies are essentially two sides of the same coin, they're both tax incentives that encourage having children, and we should say that Vance has since come out in favor of a tax credit. The optics are obviously very different. Harris's third policy is about food prices. Here, she's promising to send Congress proposed federal limits on price increases for food producers and grocers to combat what she describes as price gouging. This is perhaps a policy that's attracted the most attention in the media, and most of it's been negative. Outlets like the Washington Post have dismissed the policy as an ineffective gimmick, arguing that price controls don't actually bring down prices, but just lead to shortages. Now, we're not going to get into this in too much detail here, but there are basically 2 relevant questions. First, have corporations used rising inflation expectations to increase prices disproportionately? And second, do price controls work to prevent this? With regard to the first question, there is some evidence, much of it compiled by an economist called Isabella Weber, that at least the large corporations have used the general uptick in inflation to justify price rises, even for goods that aren't directly affected by inflation. However, when it comes to the second question, it's also true that price controls have been tried at a state level in numerous American states, but have generally been pretty ineffective and have often resulted in shortages. This isn't to say that price controls can't work per se, but they're difficult to effect in practice. Anyway, Harris's fourth policy has to do with housing. While Harris has proposed some demand-side remedies to America's housing crisis, including up to $25,000 in direct support and a $10,000 tax credit for first-time buyers, most of her political attention here is focused on supply-side measures, aimed at increasing house building. These include a new tax credit for builders of homes sold to first-time buyers, the repurposing of some federal land for affordable housing, and a wider deregulation of the housing market to make it easier for developers to build. So, those are Harris's 4 specific policies, but what do they tell us about her economic instincts more generally? Well, the first thing is that Harris is clearly aware that inflation and the perception that the Biden administration is responsible for inflation is a problem for the Democrats, which is why all of her policies are explicitly about bringing down costs for consumers. Polling suggests that voters hold Harris less directly responsible for inflation than they did with Biden, and Harris is clearly trying to reposition herself as an anti-inflationary candidate, fighting for ordinary Americans and consumers against big corporations, in a way that Biden just wasn't able to. The second big takeaway as we see it is the continuation of Biden-omics, albeit with a slightly different emphasis. Again, Biden-omics was defined by two things. The first was a total disdain for deficits. The Biden administration spent a lot of money, first on post-pandemic stimulus, which, by the way, has been largely forgotten, but was immensely successful at helping the US return to pre-pandemic growth trajectory sooner than basically any other large economy, and then on industrial subsidies via policies like the Inflation Reduction Act. These weren't accompanied by equivalent tax hikes, which means that the federal government has had to borrow an awful lot of money, and the annual deficit is now nearing 7% of GDP. Like Biden, Harris is keen on spending a lot more money, although on social policies rather than industrial policies, without equivalent tax hikes, which means more borrowing. In the past, Republicans would have jumped on this to accuse the Democrats of fiscal incompetence, but because Trump ran large deficits during his time in office and is now promising both more spending and tax cuts, they've been unable to capitalize on it. The second element of Bidenomics is aesthetic. Basically, Biden liked to present himself as the defender of ordinary Americans and consumers against big corporations. This is why Biden was the first president to walk a picket line, and why his administration was so enthusiastic about antitrust suits against big companies. By attacking corporate price gouging and talking up new antitrust violations into big pharma and food companies, Harris is positioning herself in a similar way to Biden. So, will Harris's socially oriented version of Bidenomics actually work? Well, its fundamentals are politically strong. After all, who doesn't like more spending without tax hikes, or bashing big corporations? Nonetheless, whether Harris's broader pitch to voters succeeds will depend on whether or not she can maintain her distance from Biden's inflation-riddled economy, and whether or not the US economy maintains its momentum until November. If you want to keep learning, the very best way is through Imprint. That's the brand new way to learn, built from the ground up. And seriously, unless you've used the app before, you likely haven't experienced something like this. That's because Imprint is beautifully illustrated and animated, creating a highly visual, effective, and interactive learning experience built for bite-sized learning. Now, you can take advantage of their expansive library of courses, book summaries, and articles to learn about psychology, philosophy, leadership, the science of happiness, productivity systems, finance, science, technology, health and wellness, history, and more. Plus, you can learn about these things quickly, with most individual lessons taking just a few minutes to complete. That doesn't mean that it's light on information either, though. Imprint is built around the science of learning, so it helps you to build habits around learning, utilizes high-quality visuals to boost understanding, as well as letting users learn at their own pace. Ultimately, Imprint is a way to feel good about your screen time and learn something new, rather than just mindlessly scrolling on social media. So stop doom scrolling and start learning. You can do that by joining the millions of users learning on Imprint by clicking the link in the description. That way you'll get 20% off an annual plan. Plus, they'll know that you came from us.